My own background has been, certainly in the last 15 years, in theology and biblical studies. I did an undergraduate degree in social sciences way back along, and then went back to university when my youngest child started secondary school, and ended up doing a PhD in Cambridge and settling here. My PhD interest was on reading the Old Testament in the light of environmental ethics, so I was interested in bringing together environmental issues and reading of texts and meetings. I worked for a couple of years as a postdoc in the Faraday Institute, and I just finished my PhD, then taught in the DIFAC for a couple of years, and now have come back to the fold. But my interests are sort of broadening out a little bit, and this topic is one that I'm particularly interested in, exploring ideas of personhood. And I will say that if you read the abstract about what I'm going to say, it's not entirely accurate, because actually Dennis said quite a few of the things that I was going to talk about, so I had a bit of a rethink, and we will touch on those a little bit, but we won't go into Genesis 2 and 3 in the depth that I originally suggested. Okay, so why does it matter to think about who we are as people? Well, firstly, I think there are two main and quite opposite reasons. The first is the challenge of scientific reductionism, the idea that we are nothing more than the sum of our genes or our atoms, depending on which scientific discipline you're in. As Dawkins has said, we are survival machines, robot vehicles, blindly programmed to preserve the selfish molecules known as genes. This is a truth which still fills me with astonishment. And perhaps he encapsulates the views of a lot of atheist scientists, increasingly just denying that there's any more to us than molecules, genes, atoms. Or this one from Francis Crick, better known as perhaps for his studying of DNA. You, your joys and your sorrows, your memories and your ambitions, your sense of identity and free will are in fact no more than the behaviour of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. I find that actually profoundly depressing, because it takes away all the things that I find pleasurable and that give me some sort of emotional sense of enjoyment. And one of the most recent fields in sort of scientific exploration is in neuroscience. We're going to be thinking about neuroscience this afternoon. It's the whole question about consciousness, thought, decision making, and in neuroscience, increasing number of neuroscience are saying that this is entirely due to electrical impulses in the brain. There's nothing other than those. It's electrical activity, full stop. And of course, that poses all sorts of big questions, and not least for religious believers, about what we're believing in. Is it just the product of some neural impulse and or social conditioning, or what? The philosopher Thomas Metzinger summed it up like this, and he's talking about neuroscience. There's a new image of man emerging. I think this must have been translated from the German, so I apologise for the gendered language. There's a new image of humankind, we might want to say, emerging, an image that will dramatically contradict almost all traditional images humans have of themselves in the course of their cultural history. So, what do we say in response to that? We're going to look at that a little bit later on. But I also want to point the other and the opposite problem, if you like, why we need to think about what it means to be human. And Roger's touched on this a little bit this morning, and it's certainly where I came into the debate. And this is the whole problem of human hubris in a world that's under a lot of stress. So we have a drive for ever-increasing economic growth, the sort of default model of Western economics is that we can always get bigger and better and have more and more and more. And I think that poses problems. The way that leads to exploitation of people and of the planet through greed and corruption, again, these are things that Roger has already very helpfully and totally unbeknownst to me touched on this morning. we perhaps have overstated our view of what it means to be human. We perhaps made ourselves, particularly those of us that are, all of us, that are Western and affluent, to be actually the masters of the world that we live in, and that we are able to control and do what we like with it. That was certainly true of the sort of Victorian deist understanding of the world, that it was a machine and that we could use it and exploit it. It was there to be uncovered, discovered. It was even there some 19th century thought was that we would overturn the effects of the fall by subduing nature, and that meant mining and extracting resources and hunting wild game and so on. There's another trend that's just really been drawn to, certainly to my attention, which probably I think I was aware of, and probably you are as well, and that's the trend, again in our society, to sort of prioritise self-interest over the other. There's a couple of books being written on the trend in they're written out of research in America, increasingly to narcissism amongst particularly younger people. This is what one of the authors says. Not only are there more narcissists than ever, but non-narcissistic people, people that don't necessarily naturally focus on themselves, are seduced by the increasing emphasis on material wealth, physical appearance, celebrity worship, and attention seeking. And you've only got to look at the way that people post things of themselves on Twitter and Facebook, and the way that the media celebrity culture is literally worshipped, to see that there's a shift in values and a focus on the self that is perhaps very detrimental to this sense of who we are. And there's a confidence, I think, in our own ability to fix things that are broken. There's a confidence in the power of technology to fix problems, to solve them. So whether it's environmental, whether it's health, whether it's about looking good for longer or living longer, we're looking always for technological fixes that we can put it right. And I think that, again, that poses some serious questions for us. I want to now just look at some interesting theological questions that I think arise when we start to consider what it means to be human, and I'm really only going to touch on some of them. There'll be others that occur to you, and then I want to think a little bit about some biblical perspectives on humanity, because I think those are sometimes quite surprising. And then we'll come back to some of the theology. Okay, the first question I want to think about is, do humans have a soul? And that, of course, has been a quest on a matter of theological debate over a very long time in the entire centuries of church history. I'm not going to review the debate, but the prevalence of body-soul or matter-mind dichotomy throughout philosophy and theology is fairly evident. So it's been the idea that mind is superior to body, that material is inferior. You see it in Plato, you see it in Origen, interpreting Plato in the light of Christian theology. You see it in Descartes, whole lists of thinkers that have effectively marginalised or given lesser value to the material, to matter, than to intellect, mind, soul. And in a way that's fed into a lot of our language, the language we use in our theology. It's fed into a lot of the concepts that we have operated under. It feeds into the practical level in a lot of contexts, perhaps that perhaps value spiritual practices more than going to work. A lot of people have a sort of dichotomous view of their world if they're members of a church community, that actually what they're doing on a Sunday is far more important than what they're doing in the daily run of life. And I think that's a false dichotomy that has crept in. What's happened more recently, as we've seen, scientists are now reject that idea of dualism, but also a number of theologians are starting to realise it's incomplete and incapable of accounting for biblical and theological perspectives. So there's been a rejection in the last 20 years or so of dualism by theologians as well as by scientists. And this is what Joel Green says on the matter. The phenomenological experiences that we label soul are neither reducible to brain activity nor evidence of a substantial ontological entity such as a soul, but rather represent essential aspects or capacities of the self. So he's a theologian working in Fuller Seminary in the States. He's rejecting the reductionist view, but he's also rejecting the creation of this sort of separate ontological entity. And of course, a number of the fathers were sort of really deeply concerned with at what point the soul entered the body and at what point humans became ensouled. All sorts of debates about babies that die in the womb and children that die shortly after birth and so on, about whether and when they were ensouled and so on. So it leads to all sorts of complications. Other theologians that are thinking along these lines, people like Philip Clayson, Nancy Murphy, exploring the idea that we are actually not dualists, we are monists, which is what I just said, the idea that we are one self and there are different aspects and capacities of the one self. So Peter Clark says this: our subjective first personal account of our inner life, the sort of I that we all experience, and neuroscience's objective third personal account of our brain's activity refer to complementary aspects of a single unity. Now, of course, we have a lot of traditional imagery, particularly in the church, that is possibly rather unhelpful. We talk about going to heaven when we die. So the idea that when our physical bodies die, a bit of us goes somewhere else. We have pictures of kind of clouds and harps and angels and so on, that somehow that's the imagery that is conjured up when we talk about heaven. We have issues about how we envisage what happens in the world to come, life after death and so on. Interestingly, I don't know if you've noticed that the biblical text, the New Testament, has a lot to say about the final resurrection. We've referred to 1 Corinthians 15, but actually says very little about the in-between stage between bodily death and the final resurrection. Doesn't really give any account, and people have speculated, and the doctrine of purgatory in a way came out of that gap of understanding. If you've read C.S. Lewis's The Great Divorce, he paints a very lovely graphic picture from his imagination of this in-between zone. But actually, it can lead us to construct things that are not necessarily helpful and that pose a lot of questions as well as offering some tentative answers. So we'll come back to the question of what happens when we die. If we are entities and we die, what happens to that self, that sense of the self? John Polkinghorne talks about being held in the mind of God in that period in between, and we will come back to that if we have time a little later on. So do humans have a soul? Well, I agree with the people I quoted that we don't have a separate ontological essence of soul, but we are integrated and we have brain activity, but we also have this sense, this aspect of us that is the I that can relate to you and to the thou of God. Another question, do we have free will? Now, again, science is trying to reduce our apparent free choices to pre-programmed actions that are the product of our genes or our neurons. And certainly there has been an experiment, this guy Peter Clark has written on an experiment that was conducted about, I think, 20 years ago called the Libet experiment. And it was an experiment to try and measure whether people, when they thought they were thinking about doing something, whether their brain lit up before they actually had the thought. Now, I'm not going to go into that in any more detail because I have a feeling that Alistair Coles might talk about it this afternoon. And if he doesn't, there's a Faraday paper called the Libet experiment on the piano that Peter Clark wrote, so you can look at that. But the idea is that the conscious will in our brains is not what gives us the impulse to move our hand or shake our head or whatever, but it's something that's just neuronal. And of course that has theological implications for free will. Then on the other hand, there are problems if you remove that autonomy of decision making from us. We blame perhaps our genes on it, or our actions on our genes or our neurons. We remove any sense of moral capacity, culpability, decision making, responsibility. It seems to me that it's the thin end of a wedge. It's a slippery slope once you start to say we are not in control of our actions, or we are the products purely of biological and mechanistic processes. Where does morality come in, and how do we address the issues that arise? Do people who commit sex crimes because they have some hormonal dysfunction, should they not be held fully accountable for their deeds? Do they have any sort of excuses, if you like, and so on? And I'm not going to go into the issue actually of free will from a theological point of view, because as you know, if you've ever had this debate, it is quite a large and somewhat contentious one. My view on the issue of our free will versus a sovereign God is a bit like, in the same way, the sort of two-aspect monism, that yes and, both and, that God is at work and we have autonomy as well, and that somehow plays out in each of us in different ways and at different times with different emphases. So, do we have free will? Well, I want to say theologically, yes. I think we need to maintain that ground of free will and not let science erode it. Otherwise it's very problematic, and we will come back to that a little bit. Thirdly, what distinguishes us from other animals? If we are biological entities purely, if, as evolutionary biology tells us, as Dennis explained yesterday, our last 6 million years ago we had common ancestry with the apes, and we share a common ancestor with chimpanzees. If we have evolved as a product of natural selection and competition, what distinguishes us from other animals? And psychologists have tried to come up with lists of things that make us different. I'm going to put one of them up here. This is a guy called Warren Brown, cognitive psychologist. So he identifies, I think it's 6 things that he says make us different from other animals. Firstly, language. We've got the ability to communicate infinite number of propositions, complex abstract ideas relating to future and past as well as to present. The theory of the mind, the idea that I can consider the thoughts of another person, as Dennis again said yesterday, who is himself considering the thoughts of another person, and you can, several levels of abstraction, think about what so-and-so is thinking about that person. Episodic memory, that's the ability to remember episodes in the past, events, people, times, places, and so on. Conscious mental control of behaviour, that you can decide not to do or to do something, so that's in a way free will by another name. Future orientation, the capacity to run a mental scenario and to evaluate the implications of this or that. Should I put the alarm on snooze and roll over for another 5 minutes, or should I get up so that I've got time to get to my lecture when I should? We make those decisions all the time. And then emotional modulation, able to discern emotions in other people and modulate their behaviour accordingly, to have the appropriate response to somebody else, and to make decisions appropriately. Now, you probably can think of a major problem with that definition of what it means to be human, or that distinguishing feature, and that is that it excludes quite a large percentage of population of human beings. It excludes, well, you could get around the children thing by saying this is characteristic of adulthood, but it also excludes people who have some kind of mental incapacity, or people who have lost their ability in one sense or another to function fully. And my mother-in-law died at a great age after having had dementia for many, many years, and of course we've all known relatives like that. So those certainly didn't apply to her. So we're on dangerous ground when we're trying to sort of define it, that we always have exclusion zones. And you could say, well, this is the description of a typical, you would have to say a typical adult human above average IQ, with a good degree of social awareness, and there are probably people that you know that perhaps don't have as much emotional modulation as one might expect. So it becomes a bit of a slippery thing. So that brings us back to, okay, then what does distinguish us from other animals? And it's here that I want to move back into theology. I want to think a little bit about image of God, and I want to think about some of the other human characteristics that the Bible talks about that might tell us what it means to be human, and also might explore the other side, the sense that perhaps we're not as great as we sometimes make ourselves out to be. And I want to talk just a little bit about reading Genesis 1 and 2 first, because that's where we're 1, 2 and 3, 1 and 2 to 3. That's where we're going to start. We haven't really talked about reading Genesis 1 yet in this course. It usually does come up in these courses. You'll have gathered from Dennis's talk, he assumed evolutionary biology, as I do too, as the correct scientific account of how the world came into being. And I know Dennis and I, along with I, would see that that's not in any contradiction to Genesis 1 or Genesis 2 and 3, because of the way that those accounts are trying to make sense of the world around them. And so when I think about Genesis 1 and 2, and indeed the rest of the biblical corpus, I'm trying to think about how the ancient writers were making sense of their worlds. Firstly, that's not necessarily where I end, and we move on into theological interpretations in the Christian tradition, but we're starting with things like noting genre and style. So I'm sure you've noted this, that Genesis 1 is this series of sort of rhythmic prose in a series of stages. 3 stages of God separating, 3 stages of God filling, repetitions of key phrase, the names of the days, it was good, God looked and saw, and so on and so forth. And if you've ever read a commentary on Genesis 1, you'll realise that the pattern is not completely rhythmic, it varies a little bit along the way just to save you getting too kind of used to it, but basically there is this rhythmic flow. Some scholars think that this is patterned on the pattern of the tabernacle in Exodus. That's part of Exodus. It's mirroring that, and the idea that the earth, the cosmos, is the dwelling place of God, just as the tabernacle was the dwelling place of Yahweh for the ancient Israelites, is an idea that's been put forward. We have evidence that these texts are deliberately countering other ancient Near Eastern presuppositions, so they are in contrast to them. So in ancient Near Eastern mythology, creation mythology, the gods create because they want, well, no, let me backtrack. The gods are at war amongst themselves, and out of that the physical stuff of the earth is formed. So in the Babylonian myth, Marduk one of the gods is fighting Tiamat, one of them, and other ones, and when he destroys her, the earth is formed out of her body. So you've got these stories of cosmogony and cosmology that are all about gods at war. And here in the Genesis account, we read something that's very different. It's talking about the one God. It's talking about him making matter out of chaos and tohu vabohu, emptiness, perhaps. We're not going to get into debates about ex nihilo creation here. And another example from Genesis 1 is the naming of the two lights. You've noticed that they're called the Great Light and the Lesser Light. And that's probably an attempt to demythologize Babylonian mythology, which worshipped the sun and the moon, and is not naming the lights to make that clear that these are created, not divine. You notice too that humans are created on the same day as the other land animals. In that sense, Genesis 1 puts us within the orbit of land life on land. It doesn't separate humans out in terms of the days of creation. I think that's a really interesting point. We cannot read back into that evolutionary biology, but it draws us pause for thought that actually for the author of Genesis 1, actually humans were part of that world of land animals. And they were within that framework. And the other thing that strikes me before we get on to the image of God language in Genesis 1 is that when you, and I have to mention this because it's so often misinterpreted, at the end of that creation account, I think it's actually at the beginning of chapter 2, it says, the Lord God saw all that he had made, and behold, it was very good. There's been a huge trend in Christian theology to call human creation the pinnacle of creation, to see that this is the absolute seal on God's creation. It's actually an idea that first surfaces, I think, in Philo, the Jewish theologian, first century historian and theologian, and then is taken on by Christian theologians. I think it has problems because it leads to a misunderstanding of the text. So this idea of us being the pinnacle of creation does lead into hubris, I think, and it also doesn't read the text closely, which says God saw all that he had made and it was very good. So that the very good applies to the totality of creation, and I think we need to learn to see the totality of God's creation as very good like that. Okay, let's think a little bit. Let's think a little bit about image of God. In chapter verse 26, we read, God said, let us make humankind in our own image. He made them male and female in his own image and likeness. And there have been a range of interpretations of that over the centuries. In fact, if you look into Genesis commentaries that you undoubtedly have on the shelves of Westminster or wherever the biblical commentaries are, Westermann's commentary on Genesis 1 to 11 and Gordon Wenham's commentary on Genesis 1 to 15, they each have a 2 or 3 page kind of excursus on interpretations of image of God, image and likeness of God language, and they go into some of the background, how different ages of the church have interpreted it. So, for example, Irenaeus thought that image and likeness are two different things. The image was the rational self and was unaffected by the fall. The likeness to God is what became distorted by the fall and is what is being renewed and restored by Christ's work. Aquinas saw image and likeness as being the same, but they just were the intellect, the human intellect, that human intellect was superior to the lower powers, what he called the lower powers, in other words, physical abilities. So there you see that dualism coming in. So it's the image and likeness of God that is our intellect and our reason and makes us superior to animals who don't have intellect and reason. Calvin followed Augustine in seeing us as a mirror, people as a mirror, reflecting God as a mirror reflects, and you might want to think of some New Testament texts that might well support that. Barth argued that the key to the text is the male and female, and that it's in relationality that the identity of God is expressed. Now that's just a sample, if you like. I think that there are a couple of things I'd like to say about image of God. In fact, I think there are three aspects to the image of God. I think it is clearly relational. I think that the tone and the tenor of the text changes at that point. The whole sort of blessing and commissioning of the humans in God's image is very significant. And if we look into the New Testament, you see that actually it is Christ that is called the image of the invisible God in the book of Colossians. And that again, it's relational language. It's talking about Christ in relation to God the Father. So relationship is very important there. I would go on to say though, if you read the Old Testament carefully, you actually find that relationality is not exclusive to human beings. So in fact this was the fruit of my PhD research, which I think you can find on the book table, was that actually there's a three-way connection, if you like, that's often explored in biblical texts between God as creator, humankind, and the rest of creation. And it's a kind of an interconnection that plays out in a lot of different ways, which I'm not going to look into. I think tomorrow morning Dave Booklist may look at that a little bit. So the relationship with God is not something that distinguishes us from human beings, but it is of a particular type. The second thing to talk about is the idea that image is representation. In some ways we are representing God on earth. Now here we go to the ancient Near Eastern background, which saw the possibility that a king could set up an image of himself in a particular place to represent his rule. So if a king had conquered a land and he wanted to sort of stake his claim to it, if you like, he would put up a statue of himself, and that would tell everybody that actually Azerbaijan is now king of this area. And I think that that idea actually is behind the language of Genesis 1, but it's what we might call democratized. It's no longer that the king is the representative of God. It's that all creatures are, so, all human creatures are, all human beings are. So it's broadening that scope and taking it away from being a sort of very hierarchical relationship to being one that is broader. But of course, the other side of that is that in the ancient Near East and in the Old Testament, the role of the king was to govern wisely, or the ideal role of the king was to govern wisely on behalf of his subjects. Think about Psalm 72, which is about enduing the king with God, enduing the king with wisdom and justice and so on. And again, that echoes into the way that we actually exercise that representative nature of our purpose on earth, and how we govern wisely, rule wisely, interact with the rest of creation. We are the only creatures that are able to vastly and catastrophically affect environments other than our own. We have an impact on environments on the other side of the world. We saw evidence of deforestation in Haiti, for example. But the nature of our rational capacity means we're also the only creatures that actually can do anything to change that for the better. Okay, and the third aspect, which leads on from that, is that I think we have responsibility. I think that the mandate in Genesis 1 and the picture of the first human being placed in a garden to tend and care for it in Genesis 2 give a sense of responsibility. Now, if we went back to Warren Brown's list, you'd say, well, actually that latter one also applies to people without mental capacity, people who have dementia and so on. They are not able to act responsibly. I think that's true, but I think that it's really important that we recognise that the first two actually apply to people, whatever their age or their mental state, that every human being has a capacity to be in relationship with God, and that is not diminished by virtue of illness or loss of language or loss of mental capacity. It's just the relationship is at the level at which that person is. That's the very nature of God, to relate. And the second is, again, I think this has implications in pastoral ministry, that I think that every human being is in some sense a representative of God on earth, and that therefore whatever someone's capacity is, whatever their circumstances are, whatever their state is, that there is something in one sense that they represent God on earth. And they may do it badly or they may do it well. And perhaps our task in the church is to promote amongst ourselves and in other people the ability to represent God better in his world. Okay, let's move over very quickly to Genesis 2 and 3. I have to confess at the outset, and Dennis knows this, that I don't read it in the same way as he does. I look at it as a story. It's not a theological treatise, and I ask myself why. I note that there's a lot of things in it that you can't really read literally with our rational mindset. So, and God is anthropomorphized. In other words, God speaks, he walks. So that gives me the clue that it's a story that isn't to be read in a sort of historical event type way. It's full of richly symbolic language. We've got rivers, we've got angels, swords, we've got a talking serpent, and so on. Gordon Wenham, in his commentary, calls it an highly symbolic story. And again, it's got contrasts and connections with ancient Near Eastern garden in other parts of ancient Near Eastern literature, the idea of or disobedient to gods. So when we come to it, I think we need to open to the fact that it may not be an event or even have a broader function being perhaps etiological, to explain the presence of something. Might have the function of being both etiological and a kind of a generic explanation for every man. And Dennis talked a bit about every man. I see it really as operating on a number of levels. So on a theological level, and this is part of its history of interpretation in Christian tradition, it operates as a reminder that we are people that make bad decisions, that we don't always do what we should do, that there are consequences of human actions, and so on and so forth. So these theological principles that come out of it. It also perhaps serves, and I think it fits very well with the ideas that anthropology puts up, that there was a gradual understanding of religion and God and the need to worship that comes out of that process of culture developing, of language developing, and Dennis did touch on that a bit in his lecture. And I don't think that we need to posit an actual Adam or a group of Neolithic farmers to satisfy the talk in the New Testament about Adam either. In Romans chapter 5, where it talks about Christ and Adam, it actually says that Adam is a type of Christ. It's reading Adam's story in Genesis 1 typologically as something that is kind of a symbol of what is to come. So that's just my perspective on Genesis 2 and 3, and you can argue with me afterwards. I want now to just, in the last 5 minutes, to look at some other biblical perspectives on being human. And these are ones that you may, I tend to feel that if you ask knowledgeable Christians what the Bible says about being human, they just sort of say, oh, we're made in the image of God, and it often stops there. Or, we're fallen sinners. One or two, depends perhaps on your theological tradition, which one you go for, but I want to put up some others. First is the sense of mystery and wonder. So I'm thinking here of Psalm 139, which is a real celebration, it seems to me, of both the biological mystery of conception and birth while I was being formed in the womb, and less scientific understanding of it than we have, obviously, but a real awareness that this was an amazing process. And of course, however much we know about conception and development of a fetus and birth, it always is amazing, and midwives still cry when a baby's born, and it's something that is still wonderful. But also it's a poem, Psalm 139, about the theological mystery of God's dealings with an individual human being. I will praise you because I am fearfully and wonderfully made, says the psalmist. Or we might want to think about Psalm 8, where the psalmist is comparing himself to the scale of the universe. When I consider the heavens, the work of your handiwork, your hands, what am I that you care for me? And he's kind of reflecting with a sense of awe and wonder that he actually can address God, and yet in comparison with the universe, he's so insignificant. And of course, if he thought he was insignificant when he looked up at the night sky, how much more perhaps do we do when we look at some of those pictures of galaxies? If you start to think about the size of the known universe, it really does take your breath away. But then there's another aspect, which is our creatureliness. I talked about the fact that we were created on the same day as other animals. Interestingly, in the Old Testament, particularly again in the Psalms, the capacity to worship God is attributed to all creation. So if you read Psalm 148, Psalm 150, it's about all that God has made, praising and worshipping him. Which we tend to think that actually that's what we can do that nothing else can do. This is what separates us from other animals. We can worship. But actually, from the biblical text anyway, that is not the point that it makes. And in fact, the biblical text points us back to the insignificance of our own efforts. Think about the book of Job, God's response to Job. Where were you when I founded the earth? God is the one, says Job, that brings rain on a land where no one lives, on a desert which is uninhabited. So the idea that the whole of God's creation is both intrinsically valuable and can worship him. Then if we think about life and death in the Old Testament, I'm just writing actually an essay for a textbook on for introduction to the Old Testament, and I've got the chapter on the human condition. So this is right what I'm doing at the moment, although I'm not going to give you the fruit of my research. But we read that life is God-breathed. Genesis 2, God breathed into Adam. Psalm 104, also the idea that God puts his breath in, and then when he takes his breath away, somebody or an animal dies. The idea that life is from the dust and returns to it. In fact, this idea that of dust and earth is far, far more prevalent in the Old Testament than anything to do with the image of God. Image of God language crops up in Genesis chapter 1, chapter 5, once elsewhere, and then not again until the intertestamental, the pseudographical literature, Ben Sira, for example. So image of God is not a big concept in the text of the Old Testament, but dust, earth, our earthly beginning is. And I think that the Old Testament has a very robust view about death. It sees death as a natural and inevitable part of the biological process. It sees, if you think about, I think it's the death of Abraham and some of the other great heroes of the faith, it says Abraham died old and full of years and was gathered to his fathers. Now, I think that's an absolutely wonderful expression because it just says something about a life well lived, coming to its completion. Sadly, of course, that's not always the case in our own experience or indeed in the biblical text, but there is something very complete about somebody getting to the end of their life, seeing that they've passed on to the next generation, or seeing that they've fulfilled what God set them out to do. The concern in the Old Testament is what you might call premature death. Death in an unappointed time. So death through violence. Think about also the death of, or the illness of Hezekiah in Isaiah chapters 38, 39, where he prays that he won't die from this illness, and God relents and he's healed. And it was the premature death that his poem kind of is anguished about. And of course, I think that's probably true for us. It's always sad when somebody dies that we know, but of course we feel that greater sense of sorrow if it's somebody who had not lived their full life, and we wrestle with that. And then life is fragile and transient, according to the Old Testament. It's really aware of the sense that we are frail, we are temporary. I think that speaks a lot against this sense of hubris that we perhaps think we can manage everything, run everything, kind of live forever and so on. I don't think theologically that is meant to be an option. And then I have talked about humility, not hubris. I will just refer to the Tower of Babel story, for example, some of the prophetic oracles in the prophets against Tyre and Assyria. The hubris of human attempts to be in the place of God are very much spelt out in the biblical text. And how we apply that into our world has implications in ethics, what we are trying to do, what we can do, the whole notion of playing God. We're not going to talk about that this morning. Hopefully we might this afternoon. And implications about how we live in the world. And more of that tomorrow morning. I'm just going to conclude with, my time has run out. I just want to put up another quote from Joel Green. And he's been talking about how our self-identity is formed in our relationality and in our embodied narrativity, he says, the stories by which we make sense of our lives and the world. And he concludes, who we are, our personhood, is inextricably bound up in our physicality, and so is inextricably tied up to the cosmos God has created, and to the sum of our life, in the sum of our life experiences and relationships. Okay, so I will stop there. Observations, questions, anybody want to kick off?
We didn't have a very good formatting of our question, but I'm going to try to bring it together because we kind of got cut off in the middle of the discussion.
Okay.
So I think we all reacted quite positively to the kind of monism, this idea of body and soul being more intricately related, but we wondered about kind of theologically interpreting it in light of the resurrection, and how is there a continuity of identity with what we are now and the new creation? Is that just a matter of, as you said, something more would have said about being held in the mind of God, or are there other ways of understanding that?
That's a good question. I mean, I like Polkinghorne's way because I think it almost avoids the problem, which maybe a cop-out. It seems to me we know nothing about the in-between times biblically. What we know from 1 Corinthians 15 about the sort of the ultimate resurrection is sketchy in the least, to say the least. And the idea is that is a recognisable physicality, it seems to me. But then, of course, the question comes up at, at what age? Am I going to be recognisable to people this room or people that knew me when I was 60? So there's all sorts of completely unponderable questions. I think that what I would say, and this is not an affirmation because I can prove it or the scripture necessarily, it's just this sense that if myself, my I is the I that I am self-conscious of, it is what makes me as opposed to somebody else, then it must somehow be carried forward, and that includes everything that I am. And I'm
Bodily as well.
I think so somehow, but I don't know how that works out in format because, of course, hopefully by the time we all die, we will have had 60, 70, 80 years of bodily existence. So which bit of it and how is that represented? I don't know if anyone has any comments on that one. I think it's almost an imponderable. And I think that the language that Polkinghorne uses of the mind of God takes it out of the sort of realm of the kind of limits of our understanding and our knowledge, and puts it firmly in God's purview, which I suppose is what we have to do with those questions. But I'm going to change persona and be the chair and say, now come on, I'm sure you've all got something to say about this because you were talking. If you've got comments you'd like to make, or anyone wants to pick up on that comment, then do. Yes?
We did have a question. Do you think Paul thought that Adam was a historical figure?
That's
And
interesting.
do we need to agree with Paul if that's the case?
Mm-hmm. That's an interesting question, and I think I would answer it by taking the tack that Augustine and I think it's certainly Calvin took with regard to a literal 7-day creation. Augustine, there's a famous quote from Augustine which he says basically nobody in their right minds thinks that God made the world in 7 days. It's a kind of a way of telling it in a way that kind of we can come to terms with, we can grapple with. And so there's a long tradition in church history of theologians not seeing that you have to read Genesis or other parts of Scripture in a literalistic way, I should say. We read them as literature, in that sense we read them as literary texts, but we don't need to read them literalistically. So on that basis, it seems to me that the question of what Paul thought is slightly irrelevant. Certainly the writer to the Hebrews talks in terms of the seventh day and resting on the seventh day. So do we assume that he had a literal interpretation of Genesis 1 or not? Does that matter given what we now know about evolutionary biology? I can understand why the problem comes. Let me just say, the problem, this may not be your problem, but one of the problems is people say, if we deny a literal Adam and we deny that Paul is referring to a literal Adam, are we also denying a literal Christ, an actual Christ? And this is obviously a slippery slope that a lot of people don't want to go down. And to be honest, I don't think that we have to imply one from the other. I think it is possible to talk, as Paul says he's doing, typologically about Adam and mean humanity. So he's talking, and typically Pauline, he's talking in kind of slightly coded language. If you've ever done Pauline exegesis in your studies, you'll know that trying to deduce what Paul means by a phrase or a statement is the fruit of, keeps commentators in royalties basically, but it's really hard sometimes to unpack him. And I think that he's talking in sort of shortened forms of it, and he uses Adam, I think, almost as a kind of a catch-all for human sinfulness and rebellion and what has gone wrong in the world that Christ puts right. And I don't think, for me, it doesn't deny the absolute reality of the person and work of Christ. It's just that Paul is talking in these kind of... So I suspect, I don't know what he would say if you would ask him. I suspect the question might be irrelevant to him, because I think it's only in post-Enlightenment Western thought that we get so hung up on these questions of historicity, and they're and it's both the product of biblical criticism and then the reaction against biblical criticism that means that these are the things we fight over. Yes.
What does the incarnation of Jesus as human reveal to us about the distinctiveness of humanity within creation?
Mm. Well, that's an interesting question, because to me, first and foremost, I would say that the incarnation makes Christ part of creation, so it affirms the whole created order. I'd like to say that first of all, so that by the Word of God becoming incarnate in the world which He created, John's Gospel sums it up beginning much better than I can. It's actually affirming something about the material world. And it's really interesting in both the birth narratives and accounts of the crucifixion and resurrection that you have the created order at play there. So you have a star, you have earthquakes, disturbance, sun, light not shining, so it seems like the created order is at work somehow, is disrupted in some way by those sort of events in the coming and the death of Christ. So that seems to me really interesting. When Christ is described in Colossians and elsewhere as the image of the invisible God, it seems to me that points us to Christ as the potential of what it means to be fully human. And one of the questions is whether, when Colossians 1 is talking, it's talking about Christ or the incarnate Word of God made flesh, or the God, is he talking about Christ's humanity or Christ's divinity? I tend to read it as talking about his humanity, that it's in his humanity that, although it talks about him creating all things, then it talks about him as the image of God in his humanity, that in his humanity he images God. And so I think that both speaks of our potentiality and models something, and also speaks of his identification with the world. So I don't know if I've answered your question. Will you come back at me on that?
When you said earlier, sorry, very much.
Yeah, I think there is a continuity with the rest of creation that Christ exhibits in his incarnation. But is there a discontinuity in him being born as a human being and not as something else?
As an ox or yeah. I suppose you could use the language of representation, and that's an interpretation you can put on Colossians, that actually Christ as the image of God is representing God to the world, in the way that Genesis seems to talk about our role, or I've interpreted Genesis as talking about our role as partly being to represent God on earth. And so I think there is the sort of theologically, could Christ have represented the whole of creation by being an ant or I think it had to be as a human, because, as I already said, we as human beings have this capacity. Even if it doesn't define ourselves, everything about us, I think the image of God does that better. But we have the capacity of language and rationality that other species don't have. We do have something more than other species. Now, it begs other questions as well.
Yeah, that's right. Maybe after the other group.
Okay, hold that question then. Is there other questions?
I don't know whether we had a question.
Tell us what you were talking about.
Well, we were talking about all sorts of things. We were talking about the idea of dementia and how that kind of idea of being able to hold together body and mind is really important, because if you have started to lose your mind, as it were, then it becomes easier to dehumanise somebody, and therefore to, how on earth could you but mistreat somebody? And so it is important to hold those, actually hold those together, and for all sorts of other reasons that we've talked about as well.
I think, and I have to say that you'll hear a bit more about this afternoon, that things like facing, in terms of pastoral issues that you will face, you probably may have already, but things like that, helping people to deal with someone in their family who's got something like dementia or Parkinson's or whatever is a huge issue. So trying to think about what it is that encapsulates the person is actually a really big pastoral theology issue. So yeah.
And it's ever so easy for us this is kind of digressing a bit, but it's ever so easy for us as ministers to, when you're busy, to say, oh well, she won't even remember that I went, so I won't bother to go. Actually, I think it does matter that you go, because who knows what's going on in what somebody's capacity is to remember when they're on their own and quiet, and you've no way of knowing.
Yes, and it respects the dignity of that person. I think there are huge issues there, and I think you're right that actually we need as best we can to try and treat people as we would as humans, fully human, even when their capacity to communicate and to perhaps remember is gone. So yeah.
We're also talking a bit about chip in or tell me I'm wrong, but we were talking a bit about how our relationships are different now than they were in Old Testament times or even New Testament times, because now in the media age where image is very important, we kind of can end up being the sum total of our last mistake, whereas in Old Testament times you were fully known by a community who knew you as a whole person, because your image wasn't sent around the world within seconds of some mistake that you made, and you were known as a whole person and not just by thousands and thousands of people because you said something stupid. And actually our responsibility to each other still matters, probably even more so. And because of somehow we've fragmented ourselves.
Yeah, I suppose it becomes a sort of an inside-outside question, isn't it? That it's very easy to have a superficial persona that people create for themselves, and you can create an identity and put it on social media or whatever, and actually it not really be you. And as you say, at a click of a button, you or somebody else has sent something round the world, and it's not how you want to be remembered. But then I think there are huge ethics in social media. I think ethical issues in social media that people need to think about. Okay, well let's go back to another group. Is there a group over there? You had a question.
Well, we had one already. I don't know if you guys have that.
Don't be shy. You can.
We were interested in how, just going back to this, taking Genesis 2 and 3 and how we do that. It portrays the fall, and we mentioned earlier about the natural, not disasters, but you know what I mean, natural phenomenons not being part of the fall. So I just wondered if we take Genesis 2 and 3, and it's just something I'm thinking about at the moment, as just metaphorical or just as a story, what do we do with the language we use of the fall and the theology and the sort of knock-on effect? Does it discount it, or is it just talking about something? There was some sort of fall, whatever that was, but can we still use the language of the fall? I suppose is my question.
That's a good question. And of course, but I'd like to say first of all that I don't think that the Old Testament uses that language.
Yeah.
And I don't think that the story in Genesis 2 isn't talking about theologically a fall in the sense that it has become part of interpretation, and it really owes a lot to Augustine. Certainly the note at Genesis is because Adam sinned, we're all sinful, is doesn't discredit, doesn't mean that it's wrong. A lot of what Augustine said was right, but we need to studies. I tend to sort of think, okay, can we just see what the text is saying and see whether we have to interpret it in that way, or if there's a more helpful. That's the sort of process that I'm going on with. I think it can be helpful. I think that it would be very alienating to the world we're in, which is largely religious at all. And I think that, so let me do outside the church. I think the language is meaningless and catastrophic, really. I think if we talk about, to get what we're talking about, if we talk about loneliness in, you know, you've got 600, to me that's what, if you're using full language in relationship and this inability to be true to ourselves, the person that God made us, it's really not language that's at all helpful, because we're meant to connect with where people are coming from and talking the language that they identify with. I think probably for some sections of the Christian tradition it's very important language and wouldn't want to be left aside. I think you can use the language even if Genesis isn't, 2 and 3 are not being read as an event, as a historical event, because what you're doing, you're in a way a little bit like you do with, I would do with Adam in the New Testament, is you're using this sort of catch-all phrase to sum up. And if somebody said to you, what do you mean by the fall? You'd sort of say, well, human rebellion against God, and the fact that, you know, you'd have a narrative to fill in. So I suppose probably we are going to go on having the language of the fall, and actually my narrative might be different from the one you would use. You know, some people here might want to use the traditional language of Adam and Eve being a historical event. I personally wouldn't, but that's your choice. So, and where else are we going? Was there a question over here, or should we go back to Neil's follow through?
Yeah.
Go on.
In a monistic understanding about the human person, we were wondering what happens to his or her spiritual capacities at biological death.
I think that I'm with Joel Green on this. He goes on to talk about biological death being the end of relationships, of spiritual capacity as a human being in this world, and so on. But then he would use the language of this carrying forward into the new resurrection. So whether, it's interesting that Paul uses the language of falling asleep to describe death. And of course, if you fall asleep, you are not conscious of anything unless you're having a really bad dream. But you know, you're in an unconscious state. And I wonder if that's a metaphorical way of seeing our spiritual capacity. I mean, when you're asleep, you could say that God has a capacity to relate to you, but you probably don't have a capacity to relate or to be aware that you're relating to God. And so I wonder if that's a helpful way of seeing it. But I'd like to qualify that because it's quite a hard one to get our heads around, and I think that there are some problems with explaining the monist position fully in terms of death, but I think there are even more problems with a dualistic view that what is a soul and where does it go and so on that make it more difficult.
It's helpful, open to more.
I'd like to actually, because you're from India, and I'd love it if you could tell us what the view is in your culture about.
You mean Christians in India?
Well, both Christians and in the predominantly Hindu.
Outside of the Christian fold, reincarnation is given belief.
In Christian?
No, outside the
outside
Christian,
Christian, yeah.
Yes. Reincarnation is hugely popular. That time didn't really have a beginning. It's a cyclical universe. So after I am dead, depending on the law of karma, I'm reborn as another human being or animal or mineral. So that's a mechanical, cyclical operation. So.
And how does the Christian tradition, does it react against that very strongly in favour of
Yeah, I
more
would think the
dualistic?
Christian understanding is by and large tripartite actually. Soul, mind and body. So that's the thinking there.
Interesting, very interesting. I haven't really talked about the tripart distinction. The problem always comes with the Hebrew and Greek words for these things, and they're segregated. In Hebrew, you think with your heart, and you feel with your stomach, or your bowels, and so it's kind of yeah.